Welcome, everyone. We'll be getting started very shortly. We're just going to everyone get into the room. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Ashanti Edwards, the Director for Professional Development here at ASCB. Today I will have our moderator, Scott Wilkinson, introduce our presenters for today. Scott, you can turn on your camera.
Hi everyone, thanks for being here today. Like Ashanti said, my name is Scott Wilkinson, and along with Rihanna Parvez, we'll be moderating this webinar today on the K99 K22 grant process. Rihanna and I are members of COMPASS, the Leadership Committee for Students and Postdocs within ASCB. Today we've got Anita Corbett. She is a professor of biology at Emory University and has taught in the biomedical PhD program a formal grant writing course for PhD students. She's going to begin this webinar today by giving a 15 to 20 minute overview of the grant process, and then we'll open it up to a panel discussion with 2 additional panelists. If at any time during the presentation or during the panel discussion you have any questions, please ask it in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, and we will get to those during the discussion period. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anita and go ahead and get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, for having me here today to talk a little bit about these grant mechanisms. And I'm really happy that I'll be joined after my brief introduction by some real experts, individuals who are recent recipients of these types of grants. So let me just share a few pieces of information specifically about these types of grant mechanisms. And then we can open it up to questions. And like I said, my colleagues who are recent recipients can also answer these questions. As Scott mentioned, I'm a professor of biology at Emory University, and I have been involved in teaching a formal grant writing course for a number of years. In fact, Scott, a number of years ago, was one of the individuals who took that class. And so just to introduce the mechanisms that we're going to talk about today, the NIH grant acronym SOUP. So the K99R00 mechanism is this Pathway to Independence Award. And these program purposes are pulled straight from, the NIH website describing these. And so this is kind of the most conventional mechanism that people think of for you would apply relatively late in postdoctoral training, but not too late. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. And it would support final training within your postdoctoral period, as well as give you 3 years of support through the R00 mechanism during your early independent research career. And then we're going to add on top of that a less well-known and less well understood, fortunately, we have a recent recipient here, this K22 Career Transition Award. So this is also a mentored career transition award to facilitate a timely transition sort of qualified postdoctoral fellows to independent positions. It is only supported by a number of the specific NIH institutes, and that may be part of the reason why it is less well understood. It doesn't have some of the limitations that the K99 does. So it's something definitely that should be more widely known by postdocs who might be interested in these kinds of mechanisms. And so just to pull one of the slides actually from the Office of Sponsored Programs from an NIH to talk a little bit about the comparison between these two. So really they have the same goal. So the K-22 is usually a mentored phase followed by an independent phase. It depends exactly on how that is structured. And it's basically all under the role of the candidate. And as I mentioned, there's only a few of the NIH institutes or ICs that actually support this program, and it's part of, and some of them have very specific eligibility criteria. So it's one of the reasons it's a little bit less well known. The K99R00 pathway to independence is a little better known in general. So it's also this two-phase mechanism. The R00 you formally apply for upon finishing the mentored phase. And there is an administrative review to ensure that you're ready for that transition. So these are typically 5 years, and the K99 award recipient has to secure a tenure track full-time assistant professor position before they can transition to the R00 mechanism. And so with all of these types of grants, I think of it as a huge balancing act. And so what reviewers are looking for, and I've sat on a number of committees that have reviewed these type of grants, is this very careful and difficult to achieve balance between the need for additional training and being prepared to go off and identify your own independent position. And so there's a lot of things that are being considered and have to be balanced in putting together a successful version of these grants. So there needs to be, and I'm going to speak mostly to the K99R00 mechanism, and then we can have our expert on the K22 answer relevant questions to that. So for the K99, there still needs to be clear need for training. So there has to be some level of training that you're going to attain during that mentored phase of the grant. So there has to be training potential. But you also have to have a clear record of accomplishments. So you need publications, you need preliminary data, convince people that you're going to be able to ask impactful questions during the course of that research. And you really have to have a developed research strategy. So you typically, with the way these grants would often be structured, is there'd be one aim that's something you're planning to complete during that mentored phase of your training. Hopefully something that's going to gain you some additional skills, a new technique, a new type of analysis, a new type of organism, followed by two aims that are going to set the stage for what you plan to do during your independent research career. And so it is very much a balancing act, because if you can't provide evidence you need further training, then people will say, oh, this person should just get a job. But if you can't convince people that you're potentially ready to go get a job, they might say, this person doesn't have enough accomplishments for this grant mechanism. So for me, I think this is actually one of the trickiest balancing acts to successfully navigate. And like I said, we have a couple of experts here who achieved this recently, and so they can tell you about their strategies. And so with respect to the K99, who is eligible, and some of these apply to the K22 as well. So US citizen or non-citizen with research or clinical doctoral degree and no more than 4 years of postdoctoral research experience. So this is a real kicker with respect to the K99. They put this time limit on this a few years ago, and they actually changed it from 5 years to 4 years several years ago. And so that really puts a very sharp point on thinking about when you might apply for these. There is, as all that text says at the bottom, there was a recent decision to allow options for 1 year of childbirth to extend this eligibility for 1 year. So some specific NIH institutes allow that. So if you have had a child during the time that you're a postdoc, you might be able to extend this limit on your time of being eligible for the K99. The K22 does not have this type of limitation. So it's potentially one of the advantages of the K22 mechanism if your work fits into one of the institutes that's actually supported by the K22 mechanism. And so back to this sort of strategic approach of trying to balance and identify how to structure your proposal. So as I already mentioned, the K-99 is sort of 1 to 2 years after which the applicant has to be competitive for the independent faculty position. And the R00 is for up to 3 years after transition to an independent position. The K-99 phase has different cost caps depending on which NIH institute. So NCI, when I looked it up, had about $130,000 a year with a small amount of indirect costs. And the R00 phase typically has a total cost limit of about $250,000 per year. So these are smaller than your typical modular research grants. And these dollars do not seem to change a lot. Modular research grants haven't changed in about 20 years since they were put in place. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room on those dollar amounts. And so what works best for the K-99 R000, and this again is taken from straight from some of the NIH language, which is, again, what I said, a well-conceived plan for 1 to 2 years of substantive mentored research training and career development that will help the individual become a competitive candidate for a tenure track faculty position and prepare them to launch their own independent research programs. So one of the challenges of this mechanism is often people are maybe applying for jobs at the same time they're applying for these grants. And so you actually cannot be moving into a faculty position technically when you're getting your K-99. So again, that's part of the balancing act. And just a couple other mentions of some other K-type mechanisms. So there's a newly launched one called Maximizing Opportunities for Scientific and Academic Independent Careers, or MOSAIC. So this is a specific postdoctoral career transition award to promote diversity. I think they've awarded 2 cohorts of this mechanism so far. It has some really different rules. And then there's some specific other ones, such as the BRAIN initiative. And I guess we would also perhaps mention the K-22. So it's always good to keep an keep searching for these type of mechanisms and keep looking, because once in a while they'll pop up and there'll be a really good opportunity that might not fit the traditional structure. And so again, back to the balancing act and how do you achieve these sort of impactful questions and developed research strategies. And so I'll just say a couple words about some of the general strategies for grant writing, and then we'll get to our panel and open it up to questions. And so other things to consider, and this has to do with timing. So if you wait till the end of the training period, then the study section might say, well, do they need additional training? And then if you apply right at the start of your training period, again, the study section might say, well, I'm not convinced this person has the potential for an independent research career. So really tricky to figure out the timing of this. It will differ depending on a number of factors, sort of traction within your proposed projects, or are you walking into something that somebody already has up and running, or you starting something de novo, as well as your previous track record and maybe even the status of your publications, for example, from your PhD, whether those papers are actually published or you're still working on them early on in your postdoctoral training. And then just thinking about the math for a minute, and these are some slides taken from Sharon Milgram, who's part of the NIH intramural office. So thinking about when you should apply for these types of applications. And so for the K-99, if you apply in your 4th year, you have no chance to resubmit. So if you get the grant in your 4th year, awesome. You're probably not going to get very much support from the K-99 mechanism. If you apply in your 3rd year and it's funded, that's also perfectly fine, right? You're all set. But if you apply in the 3rd year and you're not funded, it's possible you could run out of time to resubmit in your 4th year. And so it's always good to think about applying for these as soon as seems feasible within the structure of the grant. So if you apply during your 2nd year of postdoc, which seems super early, and it's funded, awesome, you have nothing to worry about. But if it's not funded, you have time to reapply. And it can be really difficult. People rapidly run up against this 4-year deadline and find that they don't have time to reapply. And so back to, who gets these grants? What kind of success rates do they have? These are some numbers from a little further back. but you can see that the success rate, which is a little different than the pay line, this is in the end who actually gets funded, or somewhere in the low 20%. And you can also see the particular NIH institutes that tend to support these types of grants, with NCI being up at the top. And then just those comments about the how. So these types of grants, for anybody who wrote any kind of fellowship during their graduate training or during a more traditional postdoc grant like a K or like an F32, they're very similar in that they have a total of 12 pages of kind of candidate information, everything about your background, career goals, objectives, career development, together with the research strategy. So mostly your research strategy is somewhere around 60 pages. And then there's a bunch of ancillary stuff about the support that you're going to get, information about your mentors, and all of these things are really important for the success of these proposals. And the review criteria are similar for any kind of training mechanism. And really what the reviewers are looking for is this overall impact, likelihood that the career development and research plan will enhance this particular candidate's potential for a productive, independent scientific research career. So those criteria are very similar even for the pre-doctoral and postdoctoral grants. But now they're really trying to assess, is this someone that during the time of this funding is actually going to be able to move into an independent position? And so like those other kind of mentored or training grants, they're reviewing the candidate, the career development plan, their research plan, the mentors, co-mentors, and collaborators, and then the environment and institutional commitment. And just to end on a couple general strategies for writing grant proposals, my advice, and some of the people here have heard this from me before, know your audience. So where is your proposal going? Are you writing it for NCI? Are you writing it for, Heart, Lung, and Blood? Focus on who is going to review this proposal. So also always think about the groups and the study sections that are going to review these grants. And if you don't know how to sort of seek out that information, find someone who can help you do that. Understanding the proposal mechanism is always critical. So K awards, like I said, are training grants where the research strategy, which is what we really think about as the grant, right? That's the science, that's the experiments you're going to do, but it's really just part of what is evaluated. And of course, before you write any of these kinds of grants, it's critically important to make sure that your mentor or sponsor is on board, because they're going to have to buy into this, they're going to have to help you, and they're also going to have to provide materials that are going to talk about how you're going to be trained. And then my biggest piece of advice for any type of grant is actually get a successful example. So find someone who has succeeded with that grant mechanism and ask them to share their example with you. It's the most valuable thing you can do in any type of grant mechanism. So those are sort of my background information and sort of tricks of the trade. I have some more information in these slides that I'll pass on to ASCB to let them share with you guys, but I'm going to stop sharing so we can hear from the real experts. So thank you very much.
Alrighty, thank you so much for that, Anita. At this point, we're going to turn it over to a panel discussion then with Anita and two recent recipients. We have Valerie Tutwiler is a current R00 recipient at Rutgers University, and Jelani Zarif is a K22 recipient at Johns Hopkins University. Again, if you guys have any questions for any of the three of them, please ask them in the Q&A box and not the chat box. Thank you.
So Scott, do you want us to just look from the Q&A box, or how do you want us to handle this? Do you want us to start there, or do you want to run them?
Rian and I will run through them.
Okay, perfect.
The first one I see here is, must we have a co-mentor for applying to a K99?
I can answer that if you want. So I don't know if you have to have a co-mentor, but I know when I was applying, it was highly suggested to not only have a co-mentor, but really to have a mentoring team. And I know from all of the successful applications that I had, I think they all had at least 3 or 4 people on their mentoring team. And it's also important to think about how your mentoring team can fill in different areas of training for you. So the perk of having a co-mentor is they can be geared at that specific new training that you're getting that you couldn't have gotten earlier in your postdoc because your own mentor didn't have that. And it also allows you to set yourself apart from your postdoc mentors in terms of career trajectory. The other things that I considered when forming a mentoring team was mentoring that I needed outside of the lab specifically, right? Because it's a career development award. So I had mentors or had mentors on my grant that would mentor specifically on the day-to-day running of a lab, for example, or any other type of experience that you thought you might have specifically wanted to make you a, successful faculty member.
Yeah, and I would only add to that I completely agree with Valerie about having a mentoring team, and it's really good to have members of that team that fill in specific gaps that might exist. But if you have a co-sponsor for your grant, which is really a formal role, that person needs to provide materials in the grant in the same way that the sponsor does. So it's important to kind of differentiate between a co-mentoring team and formally having a co-sponsor for the grant. And if you have a co-sponsor for the grant, they have to provide their bio sketch, their materials have to be integrated into the career development plan. And so that's a little bit of a subtle difference. And I do think a lot of K grants, and actually many of the F grants that I work on, there's value in having a formal co-sponsor as well, because again, the training potential is expanded by having expertise brought to the table by two different individuals.
Yeah, I had I had two co-mentors and then 3 people on my mentoring team. And I don't know if I needed to or not, but I submitted all of their bio sketches and they all had something in the mentoring strategy. The mentoring team, they were just pretty short, a couple of sentences and then, signing that letter versus the much longer that my mentor and co-mentor had.
Right, exactly.
I was just going to add for the K-22, I had co-sponsors. My K-22 was non-mentored because of where I was in training, but I had a team in place, and then I had 2 sponsors.
Great, thanks guys. So our next question is, how important is it for the first publication during your postdoc to be exactly in the same field as your proposed research?
I can start here. So, you want to publish. I think it should be in the same realm of what's going to appear in your application, just so you can be able to show that, you have some skin in the game regarding what you're working on, and be able to cite that in your proposal. So if you're working on some new DNA helicase and you published on that before, and you want to expand upon DNA helicase in your K99 and K22 proposal, that should be one of the first things that you cite. XYZ, we did this, we found this, here's a citation. And it should also be in your bio sketch when it talks about contributions to science. I think that makes your application look stronger. I'll stop.
So I did not have an accepted publication from my postdoc when I submitted my K99. But I will say I did not drastically change fields from what I was working on in grad school to my postdoc. So my grad school work was relevant to my K99R00 as well.
Yeah, and I think that is a bit of a balancing act. And this actually addresses some of the other questions I see in the chat, like how much preliminary data is required? What's the balance of too much data and too little? And I've sat on these K99 study sections before, and it is definitely, like I said, it is a perpetual balancing act of convincing people that you have sufficient data, but not having them say like, look, they have all this data, they have these papers, they should just go get a job. They shouldn't stay here and do this, mentored phase of training. So I think what Valerie said is super important, because if you have publications and they're clearly relevant to the field, that is important. But if you are switching for your postdoc, it could be important to have something at least in that like Jelani said, in that realm, but maybe not specifically on what you're planning to work on, because again, that could be seen as decreasing the training potential.
I think that that's a really good point to keep in mind too, when figuring out what you need more training in, right? And really making that case of, you know, why you didn't get that experience yet, and why having that additional experience would be very relevant.
Thanks, guys. So just a clarification for a previous question. So the date of PhD defense or the date of PhD graduation is used to determine the state of being a postdoc, and it's the date of the defense, not the date of graduation, just to make sure that's clear. So our next question is about, let's see, people who have an F-32. So if you have an F-32 award, it seems you have to apply for the K-99 in the middle of your F-32 to meet the 4-year K-99 application deadline. So how different should the aims be from each other in those?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky one. So, I mean, I think the thing about the F-32, so for people who may, that's kind of your conventional postdoctoral NIH support fellowship. And so it probably depends a little bit on when you would write your F-32. So if I get to be in charge and people in my lab actually write their F-32 sort of as soon as they arrive at the lab. And so their F-32 is very much like a map of here's what I'm planning to do during my postdoc. And so they might be a couple years into the F-32 when they would typically write their K-99. By that time, a lot of times, their plan for what they were thinking they were going to do for their F-32 is no longer clear cut and not as obvious. And so being able to say, here's what I got from the research I've done so far, this opens the door to me needing additional training in, I don't know, bioinformatics, in some sort of fancy microscopy, in, you know, structural biology, whatever kinds of questions it's opened. And so those aims would tend to be quite different if that's the case. I don't think that you would have to you know, if you actually did what was within your F-32, which sometimes is kind of rare in NIH grants, I don't think you would have to artificially grossly change your aim, but I think it would probably be rare that you would end up with exactly the same aim. And if you were waiting a couple of years to write your F-32, which I don't really recommend, then I would say you should decide, are you going to write an F-32 or are you going to write a K-99? So having Valerie comment on how she made that choice might be useful.
Yeah. So I mean, I ran into that same issue looking forward when I was thinking about applying. So I submitted an F-32 and it didn't get funded. And so I thought about the fact, if, you know, if I edit this and if I resubmit it, that then by the time, if it is awarded, you know, I would have wanted to be applying for a K-99. So what I did was I took a step back, I skipped a cycle, and I applied for a K-99. I never resubmitted my F-32. And it was for that very reason. I didn't, you know, want to go through and then get partway through the F-32 and then have to think about a K-99. And I knew I wanted to go into a faculty position, and I knew I wanted to apply for a K-99. So I actually submitted my K-99 application a little over a year into my postdoc. So I was on the early side of when I submitted my K-99.
For me, I didn't get an F-32. I had a foundation award as a postdoc in my first or second year, and it was a short fellowship. But I published. I completed all my aims and published the work from that. And from there, I built upon what the next questions were, and those next questions became what my aims were in my K-22, and I had publications to justify why I was asking those next questions, because I published from my first grant. Now, for me, I did 2 postdocs. So at the same institution, 2 different labs. So the Foundation Award was for my first postdoc lab, and I applied for K-22 when I was in the lab with Drew Pardo in my second lab. So So that's kind of how it worked out for me.
Thank you, guys. So the next question is about choosing, I guess, sort of choosing a postdoc. So does staying in my graduate PI's lab for a postdoc position in any way negatively impact my K22 or 9900 application?
My immediate answer would be yes. We'll see if Valerie changes that. It might depend, this could depend somewhat on your field. So I would say that there are field specific consequences for that. I think one could maneuver staying in the training lab if you're really clearly going to gain new expertise and ask new questions. But having sat on many F panel application grants, I could say that it can be very difficult to convince reviewers that you're going to get new training. And so that is a challenge, and it would be very important to very explicitly and very clearly explain how you're going to get new training by staying in the same lab where you presumably has been productive as a graduate student. Valerie, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I stayed in, so I was co-advised for my PhD and did a project that wasn't quite directly in either one of my co-advisors' labs. And I stayed in one of their labs for my postdoc. But as Anita said, I made the case for why I chose to stay in that lab for my postdoc and what expertise I could get from that advisor that I didn't get during my PhD. And two, that was one of the biggest reasons that I added a co-mentor, because I thought that it would be important to show that kind of broadening of experience since I stayed in the same lab.
And I would also say, I think I'm remembering this correctly, Valerie, that you're in biomedical engineering. And I do think that there are field specific kind of judgments of those kinds of choices. And I think, frankly, public health, biomedical engineering, some of those are a little bit more open to that than the sort of more conventional ASCB potentially type topics, like the conventional cell and molecular biology type approaches. Jelani, what's your thought?
Yeah, I didn't stay in the same lab. I actually changed institutions from PhD to postdoc. I don't know of anyone who's been successful and stayed in the same lab and applied for a K99 from NCI and gotten it. I'm sure there are cases of that, and it could be field specific. So I agree there. I don't think, I mean, if you're changing projects completely and it's in that same field and only 5 labs in the world study it, then that's fine. But if you're, looking at integrins or DNA or something, then, it better be very esoteric.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talk about this a lot with respect to F32, probably more than K99, but postdoc is, there are 3 things you could sort of readily change, right? Or which is your location, your biological question, area of investigation, and then kind of the system that you're using to do the investigation. And of course, your training potential is always going to be highest if you switch all 3 of those. But obviously, there could be reasons why you can't switch one or the other. Sometimes people can't move to another place. Sometimes people are just really fascinated by the biological question they're asking. And so it is really a good idea to think about how you can maximize your training potential, because just also it makes you a better scientist, I think, as well.
Yeah. So we're going to go back a little bit, and I know Anita sort of addressed this before, but maybe you guys can just elaborate a little bit about how much preliminary data, you want to have for your K99 or 00 application.
I think it'd be good for Valerie and Jelani to comment on that, because I just keep saying it's a delicate balancing act, so they can tell you what they did to achieve their goal.
So I would say I had a decent amount of, I guess, support for my idea preliminary data from my past work, and then preliminary data to show that I could do the studies that I was proposing to do, right, for anything that hadn't been previously published before. For my first specific aim and for my second specific aim. For my third specific aim, which is going a little bit more fully into that R00 phase, I had less preliminary data, very little preliminary data. It was more conceptual types of ideas than the support of some of the other work. I will say that was one of the comments that I got, and I've heard that other people have gotten this as well, that they didn't have preliminary data for their third aim. And so the advice that I was given was you weren't necessarily supposed to or didn't need preliminary data for that third aim. I don't know. Maybe it's right on that fine balance where, depending on who your reviewers are, if having or not having data in that third aim will be a positive or a negative. But yeah.
So I just pulled up my proposal because I couldn't remember how much preliminary data I had, and I have 5 figures in my preliminary data. I will in each. I only had 1 figure for aim 3, and that 1 figure for aim 3 was published. So it set up the rationale for why I wanted to, look at targeting glutamine metabolism and prostate cancer, which is what my third aim is on. I also had some sub aims to some of my aims, specifically aim 2, where I had a lot of mouse model stuff. So we had developed a syngeneic mouse model. It hadn't been published yet, but we had a lot of the histology already done. So that out of all of the 5 figures that I had in my K22 application, only 1 figure was not published, and that was for a sub aim for, trying to use an preclinical in vivo model to test our hypothesis. So I don't think you need, 20 figures or so. I think you need, the right amount of data to support the rationale and the hypothesis that you're planning to test. And it should align with your aims that you're proposing on your aims page.
Yeah, and I would just back up what Valerie said. I mean, in general, this is true in research grants, which is you're kind of often given somewhat of a pass for aim 3, right? Something more creative, something more that you maybe don't have as much to support. And especially for the K99R00, there has to be a little bit of leeway because you don't even know where you're going to be when you're doing that R00 piece. So convincing people that you have an interesting idea is maybe more important for that part than convincing them that you have exactly what you need to do those set of experiments, because it really is looking into a crystal ball because you don't know where you're going to be at that time.
Okay. For the next question, there's a few questions about choosing mentors for your application. So I don't know if you guys can maybe just elaborate again a little bit more about the process of choosing and whether you can have mentors outside of the US or other institutions.
Yeah, so I've had this question a little bit recently. So it depends on exactly what we mean by mentor here, which is if you're talking about, picking your PhD picking your postdoctoral mentor. I think that one of the things for anyone listening to this webinar, you obviously have an interest in considering pursuing an academic career. So I'll take this minute to get on my podium and say a few things about, I think if that is the case, if you're thinking about writing a K99, if you're interested in pursuing an academic career, the time to have a discussion with a potential postdoc mentor about how you're going to be able to build the work that is going to pave the way for you to have your own independent research plan is when you're interviewing with that person. It is not once you accept the position, it is not 2 years into the position. And so this is, to me, a super important part of the conversation. This is important even in an F32 application, obviously far more in a K99, is what kind of research are you going to get to do that's going to be independent, that's going to allow you to take away that piece of research and work on it. This is really an important conversation. And so that's very important to communicate in an F-32 application, obviously, particularly in a K-99, because you're literally writing about the piece that you are going to take away and build your independent career on. So I think that with respect to picking your postdoc mentor, that is super important. And then just a couple comments on either the co-sponsor. Again, I think Valerie had a super important point, which is they should bring something new to the table. They should have a method and a technique, an approach, a model, access to a data set, something that your primary mentor does not. And then for filling in a mentoring committee, like for me, it's been a few years since I applied for a faculty position. So I always make sure that my postdocs have like someone who recently moved into a faculty position, because that fills a gap that I don't have. So I'll get off my soapbox and see what Valerie and Jelani have to add to that.
Yeah, so I think, so I'm looking through my application. So for the K-22, I had advisory committee because you can't call them mentors. So you should have a sponsor. That sponsor or it should be somebody who loves you, who is not necessarily your mentor, but loves the work you're doing and believes in what you can become and see something in you that you don't even see. So it's very important to find that person. It can happen by accident. I met mine at AACR at the president's reception, and he's been my sponsor ever since. But you know, that's how I landed my sponsor, who's also at my institution. I also think choosing, so that's your sponsor, your mentor should be somebody who can take your idea, help you take your ideas to the next dimension. Take your passions to the next dimension as well. It's hard to choose that. It can be field specific, et cetera, but that's what you should look for. And someone who's going to give you the ball and let you run to the end zone. And depending on, you know, what type of mentoring you need. For me, I didn't need, you know, a micromanaged mentor. I just needed give me the ball and I'll do the experiments and get to the end zone. But some people may need some other mentoring style. That was just how it was for me. I don't want to take up too much time. Valerie, you want to add?
Sure. Yeah. So I was, I guess, told early on when I was starting to think about applying for a K-99 that it's important to build your proposal, right? To think about your idea and then to build your mentoring team around that idea, right? And to think about your mentoring team then as you're writing the rest of the proposal and how that'll all weave together and fit together. And so I think, you know, when you're writing down your very basic idea and thinking about what it might be, at that point, you should start thinking about what is the training that I need to get to that point, right? And then thinking about who your mentors can be really early on in the stages of planning. I found my co-mentor before I had even written my grant. I came up with, you know, maybe 3 different ideas for what direction I could take my K-99 application, you know, thought about the training and what might be the best fit for still needing training, and then thought about the mentors at that point. I hadn't written a specific aims page. I hadn't written any of my application, you know, and then I started a conversation with the person that would be my co-mentor, and his advice helped to build some of the proposal because he's an expert in the field that I'm trying to get training in, right? So that really helped, you know, incorporating that really early on. For my mentoring team, I thought about a little bit of training beyond the scientific training. Now, that may be different for every person. You might have another element of scientific training that you need a mentor for. Something that I heard, and again, I have no idea how universally true this is, but that it's important to have somebody on your mentoring team or committee or co-mentor or whatever that has had experience in taking a lot of people from postdocs into faculty positions. And ideally that they've mentored a previous K-99 R00 recipient. So that's something to consider if your primary postdoc advisor hasn't trained a lot of people for faculty positions. something that you can look for. Another thing that for me was important was, as Anita mentioned, I am in a biomedical engineering department. Knowing that I wanted to apply to engineering departments, but my postdoc was in a medical school. And so my postdoc advisor and my co-mentor was also in a medical school appointment. And so I knew that they couldn't give me advice on applying for and getting and starting a lab in an engineering program. So I had a mentor specific to engineering, to mentoring me through the process of getting a position in an engineering program. So.
Thanks. So next question is, what type of career development training can I incorporate into my grant? This person is having trouble thinking of things other than teaching and mentoring grad students. If you guys have any suggestions.
Right, so we can have Valerie and Jelani tell us what they put in, but there's a lot of opportunities. So if you're in a new field, you could take a class in the area that, you know, that field is. If you're going to be incorporating a new approach, there are places that offer, you know, Cold Spring Harbor has a lot of courses. There are opportunities to do things like that. There are opportunities to take on potentially leadership roles. So like we have a postdoc diversity council at Emory. And if you're talking about wanting to be a faculty position, taking on leadership roles can help that. You can also take on national leadership roles. You could join the Compass group from ASCB, for example. So a lot of those things I think can help. And for me, being as specific as possible when you write about those things, like planning and even things like going to meetings, like what meetings are you going to go to? And instead of just saying, I'm going to go to the, you know, whatever Cold Spring Harbor meeting, tell them what meeting, tell them when it is, give me the details, make it specific, because then to me as a reviewer, I can see that you've really thought about this. So Valerie and Jelani, what do you guys have to add? So what did you put?
Yeah, so I mean, I definitely put pretty much everything that you said, Anita, and I broke it down into a table of what I was going to do in year 1, year 2, and then beyond, although the focus of the career development is during that postdoc phase. And I put meetings, I put classes, I put seminar series, I put, if I was going to attend different like writing and, you know, manuscript writing, grant writing, lab management, different types of training that they did at my postdoc institution, you know, those types of things. And, you know, I just looked for what types of events they did in the past and cited those as the types of events that I would attend in the future. I also was very involved in some national and local leadership types of roles as well, and actually incorporated a whole leadership mentor into my training plan. And as part of that, under her mentorship, organized a conference for graduates and postdoc student career training. So it was like a full day workshop that I did as part of my career development as well. But I think that was a little bit specific to my own career goals. And most of the examples I saw didn't go quite that far in the leadership development side or career development side.
Jelani's scanning through his application to see what he put. So
yeah, so I started mine off with my career goals and objectives, and I broke those career goals and objectives down into short-term goal 1 through 3. And within those short-term goals 1 through 3, I had courses with the course number in each. So it's not, you know, hot smoke. So I had 3 courses that I've taken. I took one virtually. I will say from other K recipients here at Hopkins, they said that panels or review panels for these awards love to see biostatistics be a course. So even if you may be somewhat, if you passed it in undergrad, but you haven't taken it in years and you're trying to do all these mouse studies or something like that, a biostatistics course looks good. And use the course number.
Right.
I'm excited to hear that because that's what I'm teaching this semester.
Yeah.
So
well, it enhances the rigor and reproducibility of your application, right?
Yes. And then after the short-term goals, I had a long-term career goal, and I had that all in bold. so you can't miss it. And it's really to take, to go into academic setting. And then I had a plan for development. I talked about my advisory team, how they were going to help me develop. My collaborators, who also submitted letters, and I put their bio sketches in as well. And then I had a host of conferences like Anita and Valerie have already said, but I also had some things like leadership activities. So Hopkins has like the junior faculty leadership program. Your university may have something similar for faculty. We have an Office of Faculty Development. And I signed up for that course. Then I just wrote down what the 7-month program was. The first month does this, the second month does that. I also talked about who I plan to mentor. So I have a dedication to mentoring underrepresented scientists. And so I had a high school student who was underrepresented, as well as my MD PhD student who was underrepresented. So I talked about, making sure that they go on and become a part of the scientific community, the grants that I plan to apply for. And then here at Hopkins, we have writing accountability groups called WAGs. So all of those, I put all of that into the candidate information. Then I made a nice chart, 2018, 2019, 2020, with everything all laid out. In case they didn't want to read through all of that, they could just go to that last page and say, okay, he's going to do this, this, and this.
Yeah,
and
I recommend the table for that section.
Yeah, scientists love tables in general, right? And I love hearing Jelani talk about the specific course numbers, because this is something I tell people all the time, just be really specific. And Valerie actually reminded me also, if your institution has like an Office of Postdoctoral Education, we have a good one at Emory. It has lab management courses, conflict management, negotiation, managing a budget, all kinds of stuff I wish I had known before I started my own lab 25 years ago. And so look into those kinds of opportunities, because those are great training to get during a K99 phase.
Okay, thanks. Maybe this next question could be mostly answered by Anita, but if Valerie or Jelani have anything to add. So are K99 applications reviewed by special panels, or is it normal study section, or does it depend on which institution?
Yeah, so most of them have dedicated K99 panels. So many of them still go through CSR, the Center for Scientific Review, which is where most of the reviews happen. But there are a number of institutes that do have their own independent K99 panels. I've sat on several panels over the years. I don't think as a general rule, they have like a sitting study section the way many research grants do. I think they probably recruit people largely based on the topics that come in each time. It's pretty important because the K99R00 mechanism is pretty specific, right? And trying to identify those individuals that have the need for some additional training, but then have a plan laid out to move to a independent position is definitely challenging. And I definitely have sat in many of those discussions about where should this person fall. And I have never reviewed a K22 in all my years of reviewing grants. So I have no idea if that's a separate special study section, or if those get lumped in with some other kind of training grants. I've no idea.
I was told they went to the same pile. That's what I was told.
Okay.
But it's such a sleeper award. And I'll tell you, trainees, a lot of people are applying for the K22. So when a lot of people are applying for something, your odds are a little smaller, and very few people are applying for, another grant that pays for that pays the bill, so to speak. So, these are two options that you have.
Okay. So there's a few questions in here about trying to decide which NIH institute to submit to, and can you submit to multiple in different cycles or the same cycle? And yeah.
So yeah, I see this question going through, and so you cannot submit to multiple. You submit a grant, and then you generally you put in a preferred institute that you want it to go to, and then in the end, NIH actually mostly decides. Now, in some cases, it's very obvious what institute it should go to. In Jelani's case, I think the mechanism he applied for was specifically supported by NCI. So it was going to be go to NCI. So you cannot submit like the same application to two different NIH institutes because that just doesn't really exist. And there was another part to that, but I lost it.
It was choosing which one, yeah.
Yeah, so choosing which one is a bit challenging. So my thing is always, of course, it's where does your science fit, right? If you're working on, Jelani's mentioned his research around cancer biology. So like he's going to submit to NCI. And so you may not have broad choices, but you may be in a situation where you could submit to multiple institutions. What I always suggest then, and this is the discussion we have for the F31 grants, is gather all the information you can find about the pay lines for those different institutes, because you want to submit to the place where you have the best chance of getting your grant funded. And then you want to write the grant to that audience, right? So if you're studying something that's sort of fundamental biology, but related to cancer, NCI actually has really hard pay lines. It is tough to get stuff funded there, but NIGMS has better pay lines. So you might want to start by saying like, this stuff is fundamentally important. And we know that because when it goes awry, you can get cancer, rather than saying cancer is a really nasty disease and these mutations cause cancer. So it again is writing to the audience you want to speak to. But my answer is always find the place where you have the best chance of getting your grant funded and try and get your grant there. Yeah. I saw Valerie nodding. So
yeah, I could have gone to 2 or 3 different institutes, and that's exactly what I did. I looked at which one had the best pay line.
And it can be tricky to find that information. So some institutes clearly publish very strict pay lines. Some don't publish anything. Some publish what they call success rates, which is actually the total number that get the grant eventually between like a first and a second submission. So it can be kind of tricky to find that information.
Thanks. So for our last question, so this person is talking about having to switch postdoc labs during the pandemic. Sounds tough. So for them, they're worried about having limited preliminary data and discussing shortcomings, because of the move and things like that. So do you guys have any advice or ways to address that?
Yeah, so I mean, I have a general piece of advice in those kinds of situations, which is if I'm writing a letter of recommendation, and this might be something to discuss with letter writers in general, I would try to take that experience and turn it around from what you're seeing as a negative into a positive, right? You are showing resilience, right? Something happened during the pandemic that meant that you had to switch labs, whether one lab closed, whether there weren't opportunities. And rather than taking your ball and going home and saying, I'm done with scientific research, you found a new lab, you found a new way to pursue your passion for science. And so that should be an absolute positive. And I would make sure that that was threaded through letters, mentors' comments, what you write about your career goals, so that people could temper their expectations for what you would have for preliminary data, because it might be less than someone else.
I think that's actually going to be pretty common in the next few application cycles. So yeah, I will put that in your candidate information. If you have to switch labs, et cetera, just be upfront about it.
Yep.
I agree. And I think if you can have a good plan that can show that you can do the experiments, be, as explicit as possible if you don't have that preliminary data to show that what you're proposing is possible.
Yeah, and I know there have been discussions, although I don't know what's going to happen, because I'm on a committee for the ASB&B for discussing kind of pandemic consequences. And so we really hope that maybe they will add a year to the K99 deadline and even some of these other types of grants, because that would make a lot of sense with the impact of the pandemic on people's research projects. So keep your eyes open for that possibility.
All right, we are right at 3 o'clock. So Brianna and I wanted to thank everybody. Thank you, especially Anita, Valerie, and Jelani for all of your help. In the chat box, I've pasted a link to a survey about this session. If you guys could take it and let us know what you thought about the session, it helps us as we move forward and plan future sessions. And Anita has shared will be sharing the slides with us, and we'll be posting those on ASCB's website as well. So thanks again, everybody, for attending, and we hope you guys have a good day.
Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.